So let's talk about Lebanon. Lebanon is the biggest story right now, and everyone's talking about this big explosion that happened. The explosion was extremely devastating. I mean, it was really, really horrible. Half of the city of Beirut has been destroyed or damaged somehow. You had hospitals that were heavily damaged, forced to close down. Patients lost their lives in the blast. Nurses lost their lives. The electricity got shut down, so you had nurses having to use their cell phone flashlights to attend to their patients. It's pretty horrific. 300,000 people homeless. And this is happening right in the middle of a revolution. Right in the middle of a revolution taking place in Lebanon. This revolution has been going on since October of 2019, although they were precursing signs of a revolution taking place before that. For example, you had the garbage protests that took place from 2015 to 2016. And then you had the protests that took place over some really devastating fires that happened in Shuf and in other areas in Lebanon, which destroyed a lot of greenery, which the Lebanese people are very proud of. The Lebanese people are very proud of their green forests and their massive amounts of vegetation, wild vegetation. And so you had these devastating fires that ruined a lot of the greenery, and that really angered a lot of the Lebanese people because the government did not send planes to extinguish the flames. And so Lebanon had to rely on aid coming from Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey and Jordan. So eventually, the country just imploded into protests, massive protests that weren't really just a bunch of people holding signs. It imploded into a revolution. People wanting the entire government to resign. They want the entire government to be replaced by a new regime. One of the things that really set the people off was the fact that you had a huge amount of unemployment taking place in Lebanon. I think right now the unemployment rate is over 50%, if not around that number. Within the year of 2018, the unemployment rate was 46%. And so you had tremendous amounts of unemployment, and then the country was in huge amounts of debt, and so the Lebanese government was trying to figure out a way to acquire more government revenue. So they had a meeting in October of last year talking about different ways to get more revenue from the Lebanese citizens. And they came up with this idea of taxing gas, which is a pretty big deal, and also to do a 20-cent tax on all online phone calls. So these would be phone calls that would be done through online platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp. And that's a pretty big deal because Lebanese people, they don't want to use the regular phone line. They would much rather just use the internet because it's a lot more economical. And now they were facing the prospect of having to pay 20 cents every time they would make a phone call using WhatsApp or Facebook. And that would be pretty damn inconvenient. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, and the Lebanese people had a bunch of protests. And then this eventually escalated into protesting against other things, for example, like financial corruption and the sectarian foundation of the Lebanese government. And that leads me to another point. Lebanon is an extremely polarized country. It is a very polarized country. We saw this in the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from the late 70s all the way to the year 1990. So it lasted quite a while. And it was a sectarian war. You had the Druze, you had the Sunnis, you had the Palestinians, you had the Maronites. Lebanon, religiously speaking, is very, very divided. You have the Shiites on one corner who are very loyal to Iran, and they are in favor of a giant paramilitary organization that is backed by Iran called Hezbollah, which is really an Iranian satellite within Lebanon. It's a government within a government. They have checkpoints throughout Beirut. They also have a lot of influence, a lot of power, and they are essentially a little government, or really a big government, a very well-armed government within Lebanon. And then you have the Maronites, who are very loyal to France. The Maronites are Francophiles, and they have had quite a long history of relations with France, considering the fact that Lebanon was a territory of France for a very long time. So you have that. You have the Maronites who are loyal to France. And in fact, you have Maronites now saying that they want the French military to intervene in their country and do regime change. They want what the Americans did to Iraq. They want the French to do that to their own country. And that's pretty serious. And then you have the Sunnis in Lebanon who are very, they're very much in favor of Turkey. They love Erdogan. They worship him like a god. So you have a very divided country, religiously speaking. And you also have ethnic divisions as well. Lebanon is a mixed country, ethnically speaking. You have Arabs, you have Maronites, you have Palestinians who live there. So very small country, geographically speaking, but there is a lot going on in that country, and it is very volatile. It's like a room filled with gas, and all you have to do is just throw in a little match. From what I have heard regarding the revolution taking place in Lebanon, the people who are pushing for the revolution are also very mixed, ideologically speaking. You have Christians, you have Muslims, you also have atheist anarchists. The problem with this sort of revolution is that it eventually just divides up in the end. It's kind of like the French Revolution. You had the moderates who just wanted to get rid of the king and set up some sort of a republic, but then at the same time you had these fanatics who wanted to completely uproot all of Christianity from the country and establish a deist utopia, deist egalitarian utopia. And they eventually just began to kill each other in the end. I mean, Rizzo was killed by his own people. So when you have a revolution in which people are not divided ideologically, it never turns out in harmony. It never ends up with a harmonious relationship between the rebels. People begin to splinter from each other. They begin to divide. They begin to polarize. They begin to rival with one another. And so it's a very divided, very polarized sort of situation. And that makes it not very stable. On the other hand, you have Hezbollah, who is very united. They are all Shiite. They want to establish a Shiite utopia in Lebanon. They want to make Lebanon an Iranian territory, an Iranian satellite. So those people are actually more united than a lot of these rebels. And then you have the French, and it's very interesting. After the explosion took place, not too long after it happened, and the chaos ensued, Emmanuel Macron popped up in Lebanon. I think he, so far, is the only major world leader to come to Lebanon so far. And he didn't just come to say, hey, we want to give you guys aid, we want to help you guys out. Macron, or as they call Macron popped up in Lebanon and said things like, we will give you aid, but we will make sure that not a single euro ends up in the hands of these corrupt politicians. And so he called the politicians of Lebanon corrupt. And as we know from the history of NATO countries, when they want to intervene in a country, they begin to say things that are provocative. And going to a country that is under immense unemployment, that is, societally speaking, not united, societally speaking, very unstable, And to go to this place after a huge explosion took place in which over 130 people are dead, thousands of people injured, hundreds of thousands of people are homeless, half of the city destroyed or damaged somehow, to go into that country and then say your politicians are corrupt in the middle of a Maronite crowd who are Francophiles, who want the French to rule over Lebanon, and say your politicians are corrupt. That's very strategic. And we have to realize that we live in this post-war era where people, well, supposedly the post-war era is over, but we live in this era where we think that the ways of European imperialism are over. Germany will never go Nazi again, even though I greatly dispute that narrative. The ideas of British Empire or French Empire or Turkish Empire are over. And that's just not true. These European countries, these countries that were once great powers, they still want to be great powers. And to think otherwise is just naive. To sit there and think, well, these countries, they just want to leave everyone alone. They don't want to take other people's stuff. They just want to be by themselves. The British want to be like, hey, we just want to drink tea all day and eat little cookies and crackers all day. That's just not how it works. And these countries, they want to bring back their old empires. That's why you see the French in Libya. Why do you think you see the Frenchies in Libya? You think they're there just to, introduce escargot to these people? The French are in Libya because they want to take North Africa. They once had an empire that controlled much of North Africa. Morocco being one of the territories of the French Empire. Algeria as well. And the French once controlled Lebanon. So it's not a coincidence that right after this blast takes place, there's Mr. Macron, and he's like, I will make sure that not a single dollar goes to the hands of these corrupt politicians. Coincidental? I think not. The French want to bring back their empire, and they are using the instability to encroach into that area and to expand their influence. It's very interesting because in 2018 there was a report that came out about how the French government was deepening ties with Hezbollah intelligence. Makes you wonder why they would do that. Perhaps they are playing both sides. Perhaps they'll play Hezbollah on one side and the Maronites on the other. Get both sides to kill each other, arm both sides, or maybe arm one side, work with Germany or some other NATO country to arm the other. Strategy of tension, divide and conquer. It's a very, very old strategy. And we have to realize that when things like this are happening in the Middle East, you can rest assured that there are outside powers influencing the situation. Because they are outside powers that are just itching for some instability to take place, so that they can capitalize on the situation and take power. As long as the Middle East remains divided, it remains controlled. And here's another thing, and I just want to finish off with this. People are sitting here saying things like, yeah, it was just an accident, this big explosion. They were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in this port. Now, I'm going to repeat that. It wasn't 2,750 pounds. I'm going to repeat that in case that's what you thought. It was 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. It was sitting there for 6 years, popped up from a Russian-owned ship that was coming in from Georgia. It was heading towards Mozambique, but the owner ran out of funds, couldn't pay the toll at the Suez Canal. The ship had to dock in Lebanon, and the Lebanese determined that the ship was unmovable. It was unseeable, couldn't be maneuvered any longer. So the ship had to stay there. And so they observed all this ammonium nitrate, and the Lebanese are like, hey, we're taking this for ourselves. And for years, there were people saying, hey, the government has to remove this ammonium nitrate. It's very, very dangerous. And for 6 years, the Lebanese government did nothing about it. It's just stayed there. And to think that this ammonium nitrate, which was sitting there for years, just decided to blow up on its own To believe that is very credulous. I'm very incredulous in regards to the initial narrative. And I think as time goes on, we are going to be receiving more information that is going to reveal more and more as to what actually took place because of exactly what took place behind this explosion. And what we are going to find out is that it wasn't just something that exploded on its own. It wasn't an accident. I think what we eventually will find out is that this explosion was deliberate and it was a part of some sort of a plan. Could have been done by some NATO force. Could have been done by some Islamic terrorist trying to cause instability. I don't know at this point. But what I believe is that that explosion was not an accident and it did not erupt on its own. And they are experts in Lebanon who are also questioning the initial narrative. They're saying the way that this thing exploded, all of the details revolving around it really do indicate that there was a deliberate ignition that sparked this explosion. Whatever is happening, it's being done under the influences of outside powers and internal operatives. And it's being done as a way to cause more instability in the Middle East. It's being done as a way to continue on the same damn policies that we have been seeing for decades done by NATO. And at the end of the day, this is going to be a strategy of tension as a way to keep the Middle East divided, because as long as the Middle East is divided, the Middle East will be controlled. Bottom line. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.